My brother here, who has been moderating, he's funny. Wow. I don't know many Finnish. You're from Finland. Is that correct? You're from Finland? Yes, and his humor is like, he was cracking jokes in the beginning. I don't know if you were here, but that was really funny. Actually, I'm from the United States, and the humor is a little bit different from European humor. I don't want to generalize European humor, but one of the funniest movies I've ever seen is, it's an Irish movie called Waking Ned Devine. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's an older movie, but it's in English, but it's about a small town, and one of the winners of this town of 50 people won the lottery. But anyway, it is such a funny movie. While my wife and I were watching this movie in the United States, and there was this guy, it was a small theater, and there was a guy that was sitting in the front, and his laugh was so funny. So every time there was a funny scene, he would just start belly kind of laughing with this wah, 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 wah. And as he's laughing, I've never heard a person laugh like that. I've heard of ha 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 or ha 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 ha, but now wah, 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 wah. And as he's laughing, the few of us that are sitting in the movie theater, we're just cracking up. We can't even focus on the movie because we're so enamored by this guy's laugh. It's so funny to have that type of a whoa, whoa, whoa. Well, anyway, you had to be there, I guess. But I wanted to ask you something about, do you think God laughs? What is it that brings God joy? And I think we don't talk a lot about the joy of God. I'm going to be doing a series on the doctrine of God in our church in a couple of weeks. And, we talk a lot about God's love. When we talk about his nature, we talk about his righteousness. We talk about his holiness. We talk about him being omnipresent. In other words, he's everywhere, omniscient. He knows, knows all. He's omnipotent. He's all powerful. But we don't often talk about the joy of God. At least not with this unrestrained kind of belly laugh, kind of a joy. But I want to tell you something, that God experiences unending joy. And he does laugh. Look with me in Luke chapter 15. If you have your Bibles, turn with me to Luke chapter 15. And we're going to take a look at this. This whole chapter is kind of like three different parables talking about the lost sheep, the lost coin, and we're going to talk about the lost son here. But look with me, before we get into our text, I want to kind of preface this by looking at Luke 15 verse 10. I don't think it's on here in our PowerPoint, but in Luke 15 verse 10, Jesus says, "In the same way, I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angel of God over one sinner who repents." God experiences joy. What brings him joy is the recovery of lost sinners. Look with me in the chapter 14, in the last verse of chapter 14. It says, Jesus says that, "Let he who has ears, let him hear." And here, Jesus, whenever he says this, "Let he who has ears, let him hear," in other words, he's saying, whoever's interested in listening to me, listen to me. And he says that because not everybody's listening to Jesus. But the most unexpected people were listening to Jesus. The most unexpected persons were listening to Jesus. In chapter 15, verse 1, it says that there were tax collectors and sinners, kind of like the lowlifes of Jewish culture. And you couldn't get any lower than a tax collector in Jewish culture. But they were the ones that were listening to Jesus. The self-righteous Pharisees and scribes, they prided themselves in not only wanting to associate with these kind of people, but not even sitting next to them. In fact, it was a sign of righteousness, self-righteousness with the scribes and the Pharisees if they had no association with people like tax collectors or prostitutes or sinners. But Jesus' message of true holiness and the joy of God is to seek and save sinners. And then when we get to our passage today that starts in verse 11, this story is typically known as the prodigal son. Prodigal meaning wasteful. We get that in verse 30 where this prodigal son was very wasteful with his inheritance. But what's very interesting is that when Jesus talks about this story, theologians over time have called it the prodigal son. But I would like to actually say that this is not a really good title of this story. This story is actually about two sinful sons and one gracious father. I don't know if you know of the author Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens wrote a lot of stories like Christmas Story, Scrooge. Charles Dickens said that this story of the prodigal son is the greatest short story ever written. Charles Dickens says that. And what's very interesting is when we get to understand this story, we need to understand setting and culture. We need to understand setting and culture. I'm learning a lot about setting and culture. I've been here in Shanghai for 17 years. I'm born and raised in the United States. My parents come from Korea. No, I don't speak Korean. No, I don't speak Chinese. I only speak English. My Chinese is mama hoo hoo, really bad. But there's also not just language, but there's a lot of cultural things that I'm not necessarily aware of when it comes to culture in China. But it is interesting to see different things. So even just within generations, there's different things. So I didn't know, like, when you send somebody a smiley emoji, that's actually offensive. Did you guys know that? Or was somebody pulling my leg? Is that true? Like a smiley emoji is buhao. Like a smiley emoji means like you're very sarcastic. So, I think that's more, maybe some of you older people may not know about that, but younger people like my daughter was telling me, don't send that type of emoji. It's very offensive to people. Things like, when we were invited to our first wedding in Shanghai, we were like just so overjoyed to be invited to a Chinese wedding and to be able to experience that. And we had this, we bought, one of the nice things that I like especially in our home is clocks. And so we gave them a clock, okay, so some of you are already like, don't do that. I didn't know that. So these are some cultural things. And so I still don't know why it's bad to give clocks. Maybe somebody can tell me afterwards. But they said, don't give clocks at weddings or birthdays. And I, just to let you know, I don't mind clocks. So if you want to give me a clock, no. But these are some cultural things that we need to be able to understand this story in the cultural context when it was written. This is written in ancient Middle Eastern culture. And so that's how we need to understand it, not from a Western 21st century point of view, but we need to look at it from an ancient Middle Eastern culture point of view. And what dominated in ancient Middle Eastern culture was a shame-honor system. Shame-honor system. Honor was extremely important. Extremely important. And shame was to be avoided at all cost. Everything is done out of a shame-honor perspective. And that is what's going on in this story. The whole story is one shameful tale. And that's how the audience is going to understand it. Okay? That's how the audience is going to understand it. Everything that everybody does in this story is outrageously shameful. Kind of like rolling your eyes back kind of shameful kind of tale. thinking about some things that have shamed you or your family, or you heard a story, and what do? You just kind of roll your eyes back like, that is ridiculously shameful. Many years ago, when we kind of first moved here, there was in Jiaxing, sitting next to, not too far from Shanghai, there was I don't know if you heard this, but there was a true story of a pig farmer in Jiaxing. This is over 10 years ago. And his whole pig farm got diseased, and so he had to destroy all the pigs. And it cost money to destroy them, so what he did was, rather than destroy and burn the pigs, he just chucked them into the river. And they floated down the river into the Huangpu River right by the Bund. Did you guys hear? Those of you who were here during that time probably remember the story. And, these were like thousands of dead pigs along the Huangpu River, coming down the Huangpu River. You think that's bad enough? What was even worse is there were people on Shanghai side taking some free pigs and then salting them up and then selling them. I mean, you hear that story and you're like, you roll your eyes back like, I don't think that would happen again. It's hard to get, this is before iPhones and so forth. But you hear that type of a story and you can't help but to like roll your eyes back. And this is what's going on in the story. It is one long, shameful story. Eye-rolling back, shameful tale. The first part of the story is what I would call the joy of returning. We see that in verses 11 through 19. And then the first part, from 11 to 16, I would call a shameful rebellion. A shameful rebellion. Look with me in chapter 15, starting in verse 11. Jesus says, "A man had 2 sons. A younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the estate that falls to me.' And so he divided his wealth between them." Okay, so let's stop right there. So this is a shameful rebellion. In other words, when the son says, "Father, give me the share of the estate that falls to me," what is he saying? He is saying, I want my inheritance. When do children receive their inheritance? It's after the father dies. So what this son is saying is not only disrespectful, it is hateful. He is saying, "Father, I want you dead. I want nothing of you. I want my freedom. I want my money. I want you dead. Give me my money now." Okay, that's how the Pharisees will understand it. That's how an ancient Middle Eastern culture would understand this type of request. No son would make such an outrageous request, or at least not a respectful son. And what the Pharisees and scribes would expect from the father, if a father heard a son say, "I want you dead, give me my money," they would expect the father to slap that son upside the head, publicly scorn him. He would even have the right to kill his son in public for being so disrespectful. But what does the father do? He divided his wealth and gave it to his son. You can just see the Pharisees rolling their eyes back with such unbelief and disbelief of this type of shame